Hello chess friends and welcome to Jozarov's chess channel and welcome to my series The Mathematical Calculations and Geometries in Chess. So in this series we are searching for our possible central positions by using this big square and the little square, which really define our center. So we are searching for the pawn structures in this two important squares in the center of the board. So I've created many videos in this series, so in order to get a better understanding you should also watch my previous videos from the series. Today we talk about the so-called static center positions. In my previous video we did this central pawn immobility, which is a little bit different than this static center that we'll explain today. The central immobility, well, it often uses into this weakened positions if you push pawns in the center. Today we talk about the so-called static center because the static center has its own rules in the continuation of the game. You should really make progress in one particular way that I'll explain you in the continuation of the video. So what is a static center? What the static center is this setup of the pawns in the center. Here d4 and d5, you see these pawns are blocking each other out, so the d4 pawn cannot move forward, the d5 pawn cannot move forward, and you see in this big square we have also a sort of static center position in this big square with the pawn on f4 and here with the pawn on f5. So in order to get some kind of an advantage, in order to get some kind of a play and try to win the game, we have to create a dynamic pawn structure. In order to do that, we should search for squares that these two pawns are supporting. So it means from white's perspective, the d4 is of course supporting the c5 and the e5 square. This f4 pawn is of course supporting this e5 and the g5 square. So in order to get a new pawn structure, in order to get a dynamic pawn structure, we need to fix the positions on these supported squares by these pawns in the center. So it's not sometimes easy to create outposts on this square, so this static center position will probably lead into battle against this potential outpost. But I wanted to show you also another example of this static center pawn structure. You see, again we have d4 and d5 pawns. Again, white and black will probably try to occupy this central square. So from black's perspective, of course, we want to occupy these two squares which are supported by this d5 pawn. From white's perspective, we are trying to occupy the c5 or the e5 squares which are supported, of course, by this d4 pawn. So this is still an equal game, but yeah, if you could just imagine the position with more pieces on the board, that would be our main idea. But the problem from black's and the white's perspective, that it's really hard in this static center position, it's really hard to make this pawn move. So in order to improve the position of this e pawn, we should really push it forward. But when we do that, we leave another weakness. If you play something like, I don't know, if the knight wouldn't be here, if you play something like d takes e4, it's not about that we have now gained the pawn. I wanted just to see that we have now created another weakness in the position, and it's an isolated pawn. So that's why from black's or white's perspective, it's really hard to push these pawns here on c6, and also for white's pawn on e3. So that's why, again, although the position is much more complex than this one, again we should really search only for this potential outpost on e5 on c and c5 from white's perspective, and on e4 and c4 from black's perspective. So let's see now a couple of examples of this outposts and common ideas in this static center positions, and also this tries to push the pawn like here on c5 and on e4, and how players get punished because the players created these weaknesses by pushing pawns. In the first instructive game that I wanted to show you, it's played by Alexander Rachmanov against Jonathan Karlstedt. And here we have again a static center position. So from white's perspective, of course, we want to occupy this e5 square. From black's perspective, we are trying to occupy this e4 square. So for black it is a little bit harder to do that, because if you place the knight, of course, on e4. Then after knight takes on e4, we could play knight on d2 and we'll create a double attack on two weak pawns. On the next move, black will lose some pawns. Here in the game, Alexander Rachmanov played immediately knight on e5. Immediately on this idea. If you take this knight out, you see this is really dangerous because we can take d takes e5. If you try something like knight on e4, we can simply grab a pawn. If you try something like knight on d7, we can take with the queen. Again, we have gained a pawn, and in the next move we'll probably also take this c4 pawn. So that's why here you see this knight is very well cemented on this e5 square. It's also supported by this bishop on f4, and here you see Alexander Rachmanov, also a very nice grandmaster. He played on the simple idea on fixing the knight on the supported square in the static center. Like here, it's a square e5 supported by the pawn on d4. So you see, when you watch this little square here in the center, it is that white has really realized the position very well here, and that's why this knight outpost is very well. So let's see the continuation of the game. Here bishop on e6 was played. Now b3. This is of course an idea to kick away this important space advantage that black has created here with this pawn c4. You see, if you watched it in this big square on our side of the board, it's really annoying, this pawn on c4. So that's why this b3 idea is perfectly fine. So I'm just gonna remove now the squares from the board. And let's see now the continuation in the game. So you see, as said, we have a perfect outpost here with this knight on e5, and we are simply playing around that. So here bishop on b4 was played, knight takes on c6, we have b takes c6, and now knight on a4, we have knight on e4. So you see, black is trying now finally to do the same thing, but now f3, we have knight on d6, knight on c5. Again, we are trying another outpost on this c5, and here black decided to take out the knight. Bishop takes on c5, we have d takes c5, knight on d7, but now b4. And you see, because of this outpost on this c5 and e5 squares, the position has really changed now. It's really a whole new position. It's really something else going on now. We have now another, and it's a much more dynamic position. We have now a 3-on-2 situation on the queen side, which can get used, which we can get use of it. And we have now the bishop pair, which is very good. Of course, we want to maybe crack open the position here with the pawn, but to move e4, because black has built also very powerful pawn chain in the center, which is a good defensive system here. And here black tried immediately a5 in order to crack white's pawn majority on the queen side. We have a3, queen on f6, now queen on d4. It would be a good idea to trade off the queens here, simplify the position, going into an endgame with this bishop pair and this 3-on-2 situation on the queen side. So that's why queen on e7, we have queen on e5, f6, queen on c7, queen takes on c7, bishop takes on c7, and now rook on e8. I'm not going to explain, as I always said in my basics in chess series and in this series, that it's not about here to find all of these best tactical motifs in the game. I just want to show these examples from a strategical point of view. What are the ideas in this static center position? So king on f2 was played, g5, we have rook on c1, h5, now e4. As I said, we want to open the position, we want to crack this pawn, the pawn chain here, and try a potential b5 move, which could be deadly. So you see how the position really dramatically changed from the static position by a simple outpost. It got really dynamic, and we have now some tactical ideas, some pawn breakthrough ideas, some maybe promotion ideas here, deflection motifs, and many more, just because we changed the dynamics in the game. So rook on e7 was played, bishop on b6, a4, rook on a2, we have d takes e4, f takes e4, rook from a to e8, we have rook on d2, now bishop on f7, now rook on d4, rook takes on e4, rook takes, rook takes on e4, but now bishop on d1, and of course this is a very powerful idea. We want to create now a 3-on-1 situation against this pawn on c6 and really go into a favorable endgame. Bishop on d5 was played, bishop takes on a4, rook takes on f4, king on g1, we have rook on g4, and now rook on c2, bishop on e4, and now finally white takes this pawn on c4, rook takes on g2, king on f1, bishop on g4, rook takes on e4, very nice sacrifice. We have rook takes on e4, bishop on c6, rook on e7, and now a4, king on f7, but now a5, and in this position black resigned. You see we have 3 connected pass pawns here with the support of this bishop, and of course it would be a completely winning endgame here for white. So let's see now another example. Again we have the static center setup here with the d4 and d5. So again we are searching for an outpost from white's perspective on e4, e5 and c5, from black's perspective on e4 and c4. And the instructive game that I wanted to show you, it's played by Vasily Ivanchuk against Kiri. Vasily, the legendary Chucky, here with the white pieces. Knight from b to d7 was played, castling, rook on b1. Again, let's have this big square and little square in the center. So as said, you can see that we have now this static center. So our main goal is to occupy this central squares here in the center. So let's see how both black and white proceeded in the game. a5, a3, rook on e8, now queen on c2, and you see now knight on e4 is finally possible here by black, because we have some support by the rook on e8, bishop takes on g7, queen takes on g7, and now rook on c1, knight on d6, knight on e2, we have king on g7, now knight on f4, knight on f8, now knight on d3. You see Vasily Ivanchuk played many moves with the knight, just in order to have a good support on this potential e5 square, which is our main target, to create an outpost here. Knight on e6, now we have knight on c5, knight on c4. You see again both of the players playing on this supported squares. We have knight on d2, knight on d6, now b3, preventing now some ideas to create again an outpost on this c4 square. h5, knight on f3, f6, h3 was played, queen on f7, king on knight on h2, g5. We have knight on f1, queen on g6, queen takes on g6, king takes on g6, knight on d2. We have rook on e7, and now knight on d3, knight on g7, and now a4. Now Vasily is trying to open the b file, because he realized that he can really create now again an outpost which cannot be kicked away anymore by any pawns, because if we open the b file, then a potential b6 move is not possible anymore. Knight from g to f5 was played, now b4, a takes b4, rook takes b4, we have g4, g3, h takes g3, king on h2, and now h4, but now g4 attacking the knight, knight on h6, and now king on h3, f5. And this is now again a very important moment, because you see now after this move f6, again a potential outpost on e5 is possible. So that's why here Vasily played immediately knight on e5. So we have the static center. Whenever you have the possibility to create an outpost, do that. Here king on f5, f6 was played, now g5, king takes on g5, rook on g1, king on h5, knight on g6, knight on g8, and here knight on f4, and it was game over, because of course you in the next move you lose the knight on d6. So you see this static center position with the pawns on d5, with the central pawns, has its own rules. But let's see now when players trying to break this central control. Again, we have the static center position here. It's a game played by Dmitry Andreikin against Veselin Topalov. Here we have a static center, and both black and white tried to get some dynamics in the game. But when you have the dynamics with this static center setup, then you should really watch for these possible outcomes of this potential trades of pawns. So here you see Dmitry Andreikin played d takes c5, knight on d7 was played, but now c takes d5, e takes d5, and you see now black's problems after this trades of pieces in the center. Well, the position is now changed into a new position, which is this isolated pawn situation, and here white has a strategical advantage in the continuation of the game, although the position is still equal. But one of the main ideas is to create a blockade against this isolated pawn. So it means that we will probably create a blockade on the square d4 and go into a favorable endgame, because an isolated pawn in an endgame is really weakness. So knight on b3 was played. So here comes the idea immediately to play against this potential d4 move with this isolated pawn. Here a5 was played. Now a4, we have b6, now c6, very nice move, bishop on b4, and now king on d1. Okay, white cannot castle anymore, but the king is not so endangered here, because there's no way that black is going to open the position on the d file, because we'll create this very annoying blockade against this potential d4 move. So knight on c5, knight on d4, as I said, no more opening of this d file is possible. Knight on e4, we have bishop on b5. Now we are supporting, of course, our passed pawn. g5, h3, we have h5. Now king on c1, we have bishop on c5, king on b1, and rook on e8. Now king on a2, very nice move. Rook on a7, rook from a to d1, king on f8, and now rook from h to f1, king on g7, and now king on a1, bishop on f8. Again, you see white is not removing this pawn from the square d4, because we are not allowing this very annoying d4 pawn breakthrough. Knight on e2, still we have a very nice control, because now this other knight can also support this d4 square. Here we have g4 played by black, and now knight on f4, very nice tactical idea to create a fork here on the queen. King on g8 was played, and now knight on d5, and in this position black even resigned, because the position is really bad now. For you have to move the queen, the knight can come into the game. We have also an attacked pawn on e4, so that's why here in this position Veselin Topalov even resigned. So let's see now another example. Again, we have the static center set up here by white. Again, I wanted to just point you out in this little square and big square. So we have again the static center, but here black is trying certain dynamic in order to create a new central position. An instructive game that I wanted to show, it was played by Garry Kasparov against Miguel Illescas Cordoba here, and again black is trying to create a dynamic position here, but leaves the possibility here for Garry Kasparov to create again weakness in the center, and it's this isolated pawn. Again, you see, because we have a certain staticity, it guarantees us that this c5 move could be really a problem. There are some examples in which it is okay, but here in an early stage of the game to risk an isolated pawn. Here castling played by Garry Kasparov, also castling by black, and still it's a common theory of the queen's gambit declined, and we have now the so-called Tarrasch set up in the center. But I simply, after bishop on g5, I don't like here to play as black with this isolated pawn. It really doesn't make any sense to have this weakness through the whole game. h6 was played, especially while playing against Garry Kasparov. We have bishop on e3, rook on e8, now rook on c1, bishop on f8, knight takes on c6, b takes c6, but now you see knight on c5. Now we can occupy some more weak squares in black's position. Here bishop on d7 was played, bishop on c5, bishop takes, and now knight on c5. We have now a very powerful outpost of the knight on c5, bishop on g4, and now rook on e1. We have queen on a5, and now very good move h3, kicking away the bishop, because you see the bishop is a little bit out of game here. The bishop doesn't have good squares, so that's why bishop on f5 and now queen on d4. Well, queen takes on a2 is risky because of course here rook on a1 will follow. Here rook from a to b8 was played, but now finally a3 by Kasparov, queen on b5 and now b3. We have now very nice fixed position. This knight is very well cemented, supporting this b3 pawn. Knight on e4 was played. We have now b4. A5 was played by black, trying to undermine this space advantage that Garry Kasparov has created here. Knight takes on e4, we have bishop takes on e4, but now rook on c5. Here we have queen on b6, but now b takes a5, and Garry Kasparov has created now a very powerful supported pass pawn here. Queen on b2 was played, queen takes on b2, we have rook takes on c6. You see the position gets more and more complicated for black here. Rook on a2, we have rook on c1, rook on a3, rook on c8, rook takes on c8, king on h7, but now f3, bishop on f5, and now rook on c5, and Garry Kasparov goes here into a favorable endgame. With one pawn up, he won this game very easily. So I'm not going to show you the whole game, it's just an outcome that happened after Garry Kasparov created this isolated pawn. So let's go back. As I said, here we have this so-called static center setup with this d4 and d5. So as said, here the main ideas for white and for black is to fix the position around the supported squares by these pawns. From white's perspective, it means this c5 and d5 square. From black's perspective, the c4 and e4. As said, potential pawn moves here from white and for black in order to create a new dynamics in the game could be a weakness in the continuation of the game, because you're risking to make many weaknesses like weak squares or weak pawns. In these occasions of Garry Kasparov, you saw that black had many weaknesses on dark squares. Here in the previous example, we saw that Veselin Topalov had an isolated pawn, which was also a very annoying weakness. To continue the game with such a weakness is not good, of course. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this video, and meanwhile you can watch my other videos from this series, from this mathematical calculations and geometries in chess, which will be of course included in this basics in chess series. And you can also watch my basics in chess series, in which I show you opening principles, middle game strategies, and the end game strategies. And you can also subscribe to my channel. Thanks you for watching, guys, and chess is the best, of course.